The morning Frederick Underwood nailed that handwritten advertisement to the post outside Harlan's general store, he told himself it was purely practical, and he almost believed it. The year was 1883, and the town of Red Rock Crossing sat like a sun-baked afterthought at the edge of the New Mexico territory. A collection of adobe buildings and weathered timber storefronts strung along a single main road that turned to mud when the rains came and to choking dust when they did not. The railroad had bypassed Red Rock Crossing by 11 miles, which meant the town survived on cattle drives, on stubbornness, and on the kind of pride that men wore like a second skin because they had nothing else left to wear. Frederick had lived here his whole 31 years, first as the son of a cattle rancher, then as the cattle rancher himself after his father passed 3 winters back, and lately as the man everyone in town watched with a mixture of sympathy and bewilderment, because he was living alone in a house that was too big, tending a herd that was too large for one man, and turning down every piece of help that was offered to him. He read the notice over once before he hammered the nail through it. Wanted, housekeeper. Must be capable, honest, and of good character. Meals and a private room provided. Inquire at the Underwood Ranch, 2 miles north of Red Rock Crossing on the Cimarron Road. He had written it in his careful, even hand, the same hand his mother had taught him to write with, and the ink had smeared a little at the bottom where his palm had rested. He stepped back, looked at it, and felt the particular embarrassment of a man who has just done something that he does not fully understand his own reasons for doing. Harlan Bridges appeared in the doorway of his general store, thumbs hooked in his suspenders, watching with the comfortable nosiness that small-town storekeepers are permitted as a matter of professional right. "About time," Harlan said. "It is a practical matter," Frederick said, and picked up his hat from the post where he had rested it and fitted it back onto his head. "Sure it is," Harlan said, and went back inside, and Frederick could hear the man chuckling to himself all the way through the door. Frederick rode back to the ranch on his horse, a big roan gelding named Calhoun, and he tried not to think about the notice or about why he had written it. The truth was this: the house was fine. It was dusty, yes, and the kitchen was not what it once was, and the curtains his mother had sewn had gotten stiff with grime, and he had not washed the windows since October of last year, but it was fine. He could manage. He had been managing. What he could not manage, what he had absolutely no practical solution for, was the silence that lived inside those 4 walls like a permanent resident, the kind of silence that had weight and texture, and that pressed against a man's ribs in the middle of the night, until he found himself lying awake staring at the ceiling wondering what exactly he was working so hard for. He would not have admitted any of that to Harlan or to anyone else in Red Rock Crossing. The advertisement stayed on the post for 2 days before Eva Boone read it. She had arrived in town on the Tuesday morning stage from Santa Fe, which was herself and a carpet bag and a small wooden trunk, and the expression of a woman who had made a decision, and was committed to seeing it through regardless of what it cost her. She was 26 years old, with dark auburn hair that she wore pinned firmly at the back of her neck and brown eyes that were quick and direct, and that had a way of seeing a thing fully before she decided what she thought of it. She was not what you would call fragile. She was not what you would call soft. She was what you would call a woman who had learned early that the world did not arrange itself for your convenience, so you had best arrange yourself for it. She had come from Santa Fe because Santa Fe had become impossible, which was a long story that involved a deceased mother, a remarried father who had found himself a new family that did not include Eva, a position as a seamstress's assistant that had paid almost nothing, and a general sense that if she did not change something soon she would calcify in place and become one of those women who spent 40 years being mildly miserable in a respectable way. She had heard that the territories were places where a capable woman could make her own way, and she had $32 in her purse and the confidence, she hoped, to make that true. She read the notice on the Harlan's General Store post on her first morning in Red Rock Crossing while she was eating a bread roll she had purchased for 2 cents and thinking about what came next. She read it twice. She thought about it while she finished the roll. Then she went inside and asked Harlan Bridges where the Cimarron Road was. Harlan told her, and then he looked at her with the frank appraisal of a man who has watched a lot of people pass through and has gotten good at reading them, and said, "You heading out to Underwood Ranch?" "I believe I am," Eva said. "He is going to pretend he needs the help for the cooking and the cleaning," Harlan said. Eva looked at him. "Does he not need it?" Harlan scratched his jaw. "I suppose the house could use some attention." But Frederick Underwood has been perfectly capable of feeding himself and keeping his own floors swept for 3 years. His ranch runs tight as a drum. Man's got more discipline than any 3 other men in this county combined. "Then what does he actually need?" Eva asked. Harlan smiled slowly and said nothing, because he was a small-town storekeeper and there were limits, even for him. Eva bought a small sack of dried apples and a piece of hard cheese for her lunch, thanked Harlan, and walked the 2 miles north on the Cimarron Road carrying her carpet bag, because she had spent the last of her stagecoach money on her room at the boarding house and could not afford to hire a wagon. The Underwood Ranch announced itself gradually, the way good things often do. First there was a fence line, running straight and well-maintained along the road, the posts set solid in the earth, the wire strung taut without a single sag. Then there were cattle visible on a rise to the east, 30 or 40 of them moving slowly in the morning warmth. Then there was the house itself, a long single-story adobe with a covered porch running its full front length, and behind it a barn that was large enough to be impressive and a series of corrals that spoke of serious, ongoing work. There was a windmill turning slowly in the dry breeze. There was a vegetable garden on the south side of the house that was clearly still being attempted, with some determination, by someone who was perhaps not a natural gardener. Frederick Underwood was in the yard when Eva came through the gate. He was mending a piece of bridle leather, his big hands working the awl and thread with practiced ease, and he looked up when he heard the gate. And for a moment they both stopped and took each other's measure in the honest way that people do when there are no social formalities available to hide behind. He was a large man, well over 6 feet, built along the lines of someone who had been doing hard physical work since he was 12 years old. He had dark hair that was starting to show a little gray at the temples, a jaw that was clean-shaved today, which she suspected was an unusual condition, and eyes that were a particular shade of gray-green that she associated, in some wordless way, with weather over open country. He was wearing work clothes that were clean but had seen considerable use, and he had the particular posture of a man who was not accustomed to being caught at a disadvantage. "Miss," he said, and stood. The bridle leather lay across his knee. "My name is Eva Boone," she said. "I have come about the position." He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and she looked back at him, and then he said, "You walked out from town." "I did. That is 2 miles. I am aware of the distance," she said pleasantly. He set the bridle leather on the porch rail and wiped his hands on his trousers, which was not exactly a gesture of elegance but seemed genuine, and said, "Come inside. I will show you around." The inside of the house was better than she had expected and worse than it should have been. The bones of the place were good, solid adobe walls that kept the heat out, plank floors that had once been swept with regular care, a stone fireplace that was well built and properly vented, a kitchen with a cast-iron stove that was a good one, a model she recognized as a Glenwood from the 60s but well-maintained. There were 4 rooms, the main room, the kitchen, his bedroom, and a smaller room at the back that he showed her last, which had a cot and a window and a hook on the back of the door and was clearly meant to be the housekeeper's room. What the house also had was a layer of dust on every surface that had not been disturbed in at least a month. She could see the rings from coffee cups on the kitchen table. The curtains in the main room were the stiff, grimy ones she had imagined. The windows had not been washed. The floor near the door was tracked with dried mud. None of this was beyond ordinary neglect. None of it represented a man who could not, on his own, keep a house habitable. Eva looked at the stove, the cupboards, the dry sink, the stack of dishes that were clean but jumbled. She looked at the floor. She looked at the curtains. She looked at Frederick Underwood, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who is watching himself be assessed and does not entirely like it. "The position offers meals and a private room," she said. "And a wage," he said. $6 a month. That was fair. That was actually generous for 1883 for a housekeeper's position in the territory. She noted it. "What do the duties include?" she asked. "Cooking," he said. "Cleaning, the house. The garden if you are willing. I tend the livestock myself. I have 2 ranch hands who help with the cattle, Perez and young Tom Ashworth. You would not be responsible for them." She nodded, moving through the kitchen, opening a cupboard to look at the stores. There were beans, dried corn, salt pork, a good supply of flour, some tinned goods. Someone who knew what he was doing when it came to keeping a practical pantry. She opened the stove's firebox and checked it, then closed it. "You can cook?" he asked from the doorway. "Yes," she said, "and clean." "I have been doing both since I was 8 years old," she said, without particular emphasis. He was quiet for a moment. "The position is yours if you want it," he said, and she could tell the decision had not taken him long to arrive at, but that he was perhaps slightly surprised to have arrived at it so quickly. "I will take it," Eva said. That was the first day. She moved her trunk and carpet bag from the boarding house to the ranch the following morning, borrowing a mule and a flat cart from a man named Cisco Vargas who ran the livery, and who seemed to know, in the way of small-town men everywhere, exactly who she was and where she was going. She settled into the small room at the back of the house, hung her 2 good dresses on the hook behind the door, and stood at the window looking out at the scrub and the wide, flat sky of the New Mexico territory and thought, "Well, Eva, here you are." She was up before Frederick that first morning, which did not appear to have been his expectation. She had the stove going, coffee made, and biscuits in progress before she heard him moving in his room. When he came out, she was standing at the kitchen counter rolling biscuit dough, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at the stove with the expression of a man who has walked into a room and found it already arranged in exactly the way he would have arranged it himself, which in a man of his temperament produced not comfort but a kind of startled wariness. "I did not hear you get up," he said. "I am generally quiet in the mornings," she said. He poured himself a cup of coffee, which she had set on the back of the stove to stay warm, and he sat at the table, and she continued rolling the biscuit dough, and neither of them said anything for a few minutes. The silence was different from the silence she had been warned about. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was a silence that had room in it, the way a well-made room has room because it has been built with thought. "I can show you where things are," he said eventually. "I have mostly found them," she said. "I hope you do not mind that I looked through the kitchen cupboards yesterday afternoon." He blinked. "No, that is what you are here for." "Yes," she said. "Though I do notice that your pantry is very well stocked and systematically organized." He said nothing. "And that the dishes, while jumbled, have all been recently washed." He said nothing. "And that the floor, while muddy near the door, has been swept recently everywhere else." She turned and looked at him, and her brown eyes were direct but not unkind. "I would say within the last 3 or 4 days." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and studied it. "A man ought to keep his kitchen clean," he said at last. "He ought to," she agreed, and turned back to her biscuits, and that was the end of that conversation. But it was not the end of her thinking about it. She thought about it all through that first day, as she washed the windows and beat the curtains on the porch rail and scrubbed the mud from near the door and cooked a proper noon meal of salt pork and beans with fresh biscuits and a dried apple cake that used the apples she had bought from Harlan, and that filled the house with a smell so warm and good that she caught Frederick pausing outside the kitchen door for a full 10 seconds before he came in. She thought about what Harlan had said. She thought about the pantry and the dishes and the swept floor. She thought about a man who had built a ranch that ran, by all visible evidence, like a well-oiled machine, who had 2 reliable hands and good livestock, and a house that was, let's be honest, in need of some attention but not in crisis. She thought about the advertisement which had been posted, according to Harlan, on the previous Monday, and not before. And she thought about Frederick Underwood's face when he had first looked at her coming through the gate, not the face of a man looking at a prospective employee, but something else entirely, something that he had quickly shuttered away behind the practical expression. By the end of the first day, she had formed a theory. By noon of the second day, she was certain of it. She was in the main room, washing the front windows with a rag and a bucket of vinegar water, and she could see Frederick in the yard through the glass, working with Perez, a compact and weathered Mexican vaquero who moved with the easy grace of a man who had spent his whole life around horses. They were mending a section of corral fence, and she could see them talking, and she could tell from the way Perez occasionally glanced toward the house that the conversation was at least partly about her. At some point, Tom Ashworth came past the window carrying a saddle, and he was young, maybe 19, with a perpetually surprised expression that she suspected was simply his face. He looked at her through the glass and she waved, and he nearly dropped the saddle. She was thinking about the house, about what it told her. The back room where she slept had been prepared with care. The cot had fresh laundered blankets on it, which meant someone had recently washed them, and there was a small braided rug on the floor that was clean and free of dust, as though it had been placed there recently rather than having been there for years. The windowsill in her room had been wiped. There was a small, slightly lopsided shelf on the wall that had a candle holder on it and nothing else, as though it had been cleared specifically to be useful without being presumptuous. A man who needed a housekeeper badly enough to advertise for one did not spend the days before she arrived cleaning the room she was going to live in. A man who needed a housekeeper simply because his house was a mess would not have a clean and systematically stocked pantry or freshly laundered blankets or a swept floor in the rooms that mattered. What the house had was the quality of a man who had lived alone long enough to have gotten methodical about it, who knew where everything was and kept it serviceable, but who had stopped making the place feel like a home, because there is no point in that when you are alone, when you are the only one who will see it, when the silence has weight and lives in the walls. The curtains were dirty. The windows were grimy. The things that only matter when someone else is present to notice them, those were the things that had been neglected. That was the theory Eva Boone had formed by the end of the first day, and by noon of the second day, when she was washing the windows and watching Frederick work in the yard with the ease and competence of a man who did not need her help with anything practical, she was certain. He was not lonely for a housekeeper. He was just lonely. She felt something turn over in her chest when she understood that, something warm and quiet and careful, and she pressed the wet rag against the glass and watched him for a moment. He was a hard man to read. He had built walls with the same care and attention he had put into his corral fences, and she suspected they were just as solid. But she had seen things, small things. The way he had looked at her when she came through the gate, the way he had found reasons to pass through the house during the day when his work was clearly in the yard and the barn, the way he had sat at the kitchen table the evening before after supper and read his newspaper, but had not gone back to his room even after the lamp in the kitchen was the last light on in the house. She had poured him another cup of coffee before she went to bed, without being asked, and said good night, and he had looked up from the newspaper and said good night, and for a moment she had seen it, the thing behind the practical expression, something like gratitude so large it had to be contained in a very small gesture, and then the shutter came down again. Eva Boone had grown up with a father who showed nothing, and she had learned to read the things people could not say. She did not think that knowledge made her superior. She thought it made her careful. She wrung out the rag and moved to the next window. The following days established a rhythm. Eva cooked breakfast and supper, kept the house, worked on the garden, which she determined had been planted with enthusiasm and without enough water, and discovered that she was better at making a home out of a functional house than she had realized, because she had not had a home to make in quite some time. She replaced the stiff curtains with fresh ones she sewed from a bolt of plain cotton that she bought from Harlan, putting the cost against her wage without asking Frederick's permission first, and when he saw them, he stopped in the main room doorway and looked at them for a long moment without saying anything. "I should have asked you first," she said. "I will pay for the fabric out of my own wages if you prefer." "No," he said, "they are good." A pause. "Thank you." She nodded and went back to what she was doing. Supper was the best part of the day, she found. Frederick had a habit of coming in from the ranch work exactly at 6 in the evening, washing his hands and face at the pump in the yard, and sitting down at the kitchen table. And in those first weeks the conversation was careful and practical. What needed to be done? What was in store? How the garden was coming? But the conversations grew, the way conversations do when two people are sharing a table every evening and when neither of them is, at heart, a silent person. She told him she had come from Santa Fe, and he asked what had brought her out to the territory, and she told him the truth, which was that her mother had died 2 years ago and her father had remarried, and she had wanted to find her own way. She did not tell him all of it, not the seamstress job or the $32 or the specific texture of the loneliness that had driven her out of Santa Fe, but she told him enough that it was honest. He told her that his father had built the ranch from nothing, had started with a plot of land and 3 cows and enough stubbornness to fuel a locomotive, and that Frederick had been working the ranch since he was 16 and had loved it from the first time he understood what it was. He told her his mother had died when he was 23 and his father 3 winters back, and that the ranch had been left to him outright. "Do you have brothers or sisters?" she asked. "A brother," he said. "Daniel. He went east to study law. He is in Denver now. Do you see him? Christmas sometimes, he writes." He paused. "He thinks I should sell the ranch and go to Denver with him. What do you think?" Eva asked. Frederick looked at her across the table, and the lamp was burning between them and his gray-green eyes had that weather-over-open country quality again. "I think I would rather die than leave this place," he said, and it was said simply, without drama, which made it more convincing than a speech. "That is a good answer," she said. "Is it?" "It means you know what you want," she said. "That is not as common as people think." He looked at her for a moment, and then he poured himself more coffee, and they talked about the cattle and the price of beef at the Cimarron Railroad Depot, and the dry spell that had been going on for 3 weeks, and whether the rains would come in from the east before October. It was a perfectly ordinary conversation, and she found herself looking forward to the next one in a way that she recognized, when she thought about it later lying in her small room with the braided rug on the floor and the stars visible through the window, as something that was beginning to matter to her. On a Saturday afternoon in late August, about 3 weeks after she had arrived at the ranch, Eva went into town to pick up supplies from Harlan's store. She was driving the wagon, which Frederick had shown her how to manage, and Harlan helped her load the flour and the salt and the coffee and the various other things on the list into the wagon bed, and then he leaned on the wagon side and looked at her with the comfortable nosiness. "How are you getting on out there?" he asked. "Very well," she said. "Frederick treating you right?" "He is a fair employer," she said, which was true and also told nothing. Harlan nodded. "He's a good man. Has been carrying some weight since his father went. Runs that ranch by himself more or less. Those 2 hands are good boys, but Frederick does the work of 3 men." He paused. "His mother used to say he was born stubborn. She said it like it was a compliment." "I can see why she would," Eva said. She drove back to the ranch thinking about what Harlan had said about a man carrying weight. She thought about the house and its particular loneliness, the kind that had settled into the walls over years and that she had been slowly, steadily displacing, without making a show of it, by the simple act of being present and making meals and sewing curtains and keeping a light on in the kitchen. She thought about what it cost a man like Frederick Underwood to have posted that advertisement, knowing what it would say about him to the town, knowing that Harlan would chuckle, knowing that people would draw their own conclusions. It must have cost him something considerable, because he was not a man who asked for things. When she got back to the ranch, she found that Perez and Tom had gone for the day, and Frederick was in the barn with a mare who was off one of her front shoes. He was crouched beside the horse, holding her leg, examining the hoof, and he looked up when Eva came in. "I need to get her Rashad," he said. "I will ride into the farrier's tomorrow." "I got everything on the list," she said, and leaned against the barn doorway, and the afternoon light came in long and gold behind her, and the mare huffed quietly and shifted her weight. "Good," he said. He set the hoof down gently and straightened up, and he was taller even than she remembered when he was standing at full height in an enclosed space. "Thank you for going in." "It was no trouble," she said. There was a pause, and he ran a hand along the mare's neck, and the horse leaned into him the way horses do when they trust a person completely. "What is her name?" Eva asked. "Rosie," he said, which was such an unexpectedly gentle name for such a big man to give a horse that Eva felt something shift in her again, that warm, careful thing. "She was my mother's horse originally. Old girl now, but she still goes." "She is beautiful," Eva said, and she meant the horse, but she was also thinking about what a man reveals about himself by the names he gives to things. "You ride?" Frederick asked. "Not well," she admitted. "I grew up in a town. I can manage a wagon horse, but proper riding I never learned." He looked at her with an expression she could not quite read, something between considering and decided, and said, "I could teach you if you wanted." She looked at him. "You would do that?" "It is useful to know out here," he said, which was perfectly practical, and also, she was certain, not entirely the reason he had offered. "All right," she said. "Yes, thank you." He nodded and turned back to the mare, and she went to unload the wagon, and the afternoon stretched out long and warm around the ranch, and she found herself smiling at the side of the wagon for no particular reason she was willing to name. He started teaching her on the following Tuesday, with a calm, older quarter horse named George, who was, Frederick said, the most patient horse he had ever owned, and who would carry a beginning rider without complaint. Eva was not what you would call a natural that first lesson. She was stiff and cautious, and she gripped the saddle horn in a way that Frederick, standing beside her in the yard, politely did not comment on. He showed her how to hold the reins, how to use her legs, how to sit balanced rather than braced. "You are fighting him," he said, walking alongside her as she made a slow circle of the yard. "He can feel that you are tense. Horses read tension. Try to breathe." "I am breathing," she said. "You are doing something," he said. "I am not sure I would call it breathing." She laughed, which surprised them both, and in that moment of surprise she stopped being rigid and George moved more smoothly beneath her, and she understood, in a physical and immediate way, what Frederick meant. "There," he said, and the word was quiet, but she heard it. They did this twice a week after that, sometimes in the morning before the heat of the day, sometimes in the early evening. She got better steadily, the way people do when they are learning something from a teacher who has patience and who actually knows what they are talking about. Frederick was a good teacher because he did not condescend, and because he expected her to understand things once he had explained them, which she found more respectful than encouragement. On the fourth lesson she took George out of the yard and down the lane toward the open pasture, and Frederick rode alongside her on Cowhound, and it was the first time they had been side by side on horseback together, and she was aware of him in a new way, the ease he had in the saddle, the way he was part of the horse, the way he looked entirely, completely at home in this landscape in a way that made the landscape make more sense to have him in it. "You are doing well," he said. "I may keep at this," she said. "You should," he said. "There is nothing like it." They rode in silence for a while along the lane, the late afternoon spreading around them in that particular gold the New Mexico territory does in September, and the scrub oak on the hillside was beginning to think about turning, and the air smelled of dust and sage and cattle from a distance, and Eva thought that this was perhaps one of the finest afternoons she had experienced in quite some time, and she thought about what it meant that she thought so. She had been at the ranch 5 weeks now. She had stopped thinking of it as a position and started thinking of it as, carefully, tentatively, something like a place she was glad to be. She knew that was different from a home, and she knew the difference mattered, but she could not entirely control what she felt at 6 in the evening when she heard Frederick come in from the yard and wash his hands at the pump, and she felt the particular relief of that sound, the uncomplicated and unreasonable gladness. She was not foolish. She was practical. She knew that she was an employee, and that whatever Frederick Underwood felt for her, if he felt anything, was complicated by the particular arrangement they were in, where she lived in his house and cooked his meals and was, in some economic reality, dependent on his continued goodwill. She had watched enough of the world to know that arrangements like that could go wrong very easily, and she had no intention of letting her own feelings make her careless. And yet, it was Perez who introduced the complication that changed the shape of things. Perez was a man of about 45, quiet and economical with words, deeply experienced with cattle and horses, and Eva had formed a good opinion of him in the first week. He called her Miss Boone and treated her with the straightforward respect of a man who respected competent people, regardless of category. On a morning in mid-September, he found her in the garden wrestling with the last of the tomato plants, and he stopped to watch for a moment and then said, without preliminary, "He does not sleep well." Eva looked up at him. "I beg your pardon," Frederick, Perez said. "He did not sleep well before you came. I could see it in the mornings. 3 years of it." He paused. "He sleeps now. In the mornings I can see it." Eva sat back on her heels in the garden dirt and looked at Perez, who met her eyes steadily without any self-consciousness about what he had just said. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Perez shrugged with one shoulder. "Because I have worked for that man for 8 years, he said, "and I have watched him run this ranch by himself and take care of everything that needs taking care of and never ask anyone for a thing he does not have to ask for. And I know what it cost him to put that notice up." He paused again. "I thought you should know that." He moved on toward the barn, and Eva turned back to the tomato plants and said nothing, and she stayed in the garden for a long time after the tomatoes were done, sitting in the warm dirt with the sun coming down on her shoulders, thinking. She understood now why Perez had told her. He was not a man to say sentimental things. He was a man who dealt in evidence, and in the truth that evidence pointed to. And he was telling her that the evidence was clear, had been clear for 8 years, and that she should not let the practical arrangement obscure what was in front of her. She thought about it for 3 more days without doing anything about it, because she was careful, and because she did not know what doing something about it looked like, and because she was aware of her position and her economic dependence and did not want to make a mistake. What made the decision for her was not planning. It was a Thursday evening in late September, and she had made a stew with dumplings, and they were at the kitchen table, and the lamp was burning, and Frederick was telling her about a problem he had had with a fence line on the north pasture, a section that the cattle kept pushing through because of a water source on the other side, and he was describing the solution he had worked out with characteristic thoroughness, and she was listening and asking a question here and there, and then he said something that stopped her. He said, "I put a second post in every 8 feet, and then I strung the wire lower on the second pass, so the cattle cannot get enough purchase to push through. I worked it out this afternoon, and it seems right. I will tell you if it works." And Eva, sitting across from him with her fork in her hand, realized that she had just been told, by a man who did not volunteer information to anyone unless it mattered, about a solution he had worked out to a fence problem, with the specific intention of telling her about it, because telling her things was something he had started to do as a matter of course, because she was the person he told things to now. She set down her fork. "Frederick," she said. He looked at her. The lamp was between them and his gray-green eyes were steady. "I know why you put the notice up," she said. He did not look away. He did not say anything for a moment. He put his own fork down carefully and then he folded his hands on the table. "Do you?" he said. It was not quite a question. "You do not need a housekeeper," she said. "Or not primarily. Your house was being maintained. Your pantry was full. Your dishes were clean." He said nothing. "You needed someone to talk to," she said. "Over supper. You needed someone to come home to." She paused because she wanted to be sure she was saying it right. "You needed the house to feel like something again." He looked at the table. He looked at his folded hands. Then he looked up at her again and said, with no particular drama, "Yes." The words sat between them in the lamplight. "I am not angry," she said immediately because she wanted him to understand that clearly. "I am not." It was honest in its way. "The house does need attention. The position is real." "It is real," he said. "I have not deceived you about the work or the wage or the room." "No," she said, "you have not." Another pause, and the fire in the stove ticked quietly, and outside the wind was moving through the scrub. "I did not think anyone would understand what I was asking for," he said quietly, "if I tried to say it plainly." "What were you asking for?" she asked, though she thought she knew. He looked at her with the expression she had seen before, the one before the shutter came down, and this time he let the shutter stay open. "Company," he said, "and something more than that if I am honest. Someone." He stopped. "I have been alone in this house for 3 years and I thought I was managing it, and I was, but there is a difference between managing something and being all right." She felt the warm, careful thing in her chest open out like a hand releasing. "I know," she said. "You came through that gate with a carpet bag," he said, "and I could tell within 5 minutes that you were the most straightforward person I had encountered in quite some time, and I thought, if someone like that were willing to stay, I might learn to." He stopped again, and she could see that the words were costing him and she did not rush him. "I might learn to want things again," he said at last. "Properly." Eva Boone had not cried in quite a while, because she had been in circumstances that did not reward it, but she felt the pressure of something honest behind her eyes, and she pressed it back and said, steadily, "I want you to know that I am glad I answered that advertisement." He looked at her. "And not only because I needed the position," she said, "though I did. I am glad because I am glad to be here and I am glad to know you, and I am becoming gladder about both of those things every day." He held her gaze for a long moment and she could see him measuring what she had said against his own careful knowledge of the world and finding it solid. "Miss Boone," he said. "Eva," she said. A pause. "Eva." He said her name as though he was testing the weight of it and seemed to find it good. "I would not like to rush things. I would not like you to feel that I have put you in a position where you feel you must." "Frederick," she said. He stopped. "I am 26 years old and I have lived on my own for the last 2 years in a city that did not care about me in the slightest," she said. "I know my own mind, and I am telling you that I am glad to be here and I think you are worth knowing better. That is all. We can take as much time as we need." He looked at her for another long moment, and then something happened in his face that she had not seen before, something that was quieter than a smile but larger, something that the face of a man who has been waiting for a long time does when the waiting is, perhaps, beginning to be over. "All right," he said. "Yes." He picked up his fork. "The stew is very good." She laughed, and he looked startled and then smiled, and it was the first full, unguarded smile she had seen on him, and it changed the whole geography of his face in the best possible way. In the weeks that followed, things changed between them in a way that was gradual and then, looking back, seemed to have always been inevitable. It was not dramatic, the change. It was the kind of change that happens when two people decide, without stating it baldly, to stop being careful about caring. He began to tell her things he would not have told anyone else. About the ranch, yes, but also about his father, who had been a hard man and a good one, and whom Frederick had admired and feared in roughly equal measure, and about his mother, who had been gentler and who had known every person in the county by name, and who had died of a fever that had come on suddenly and taken her in 4 days. He told her about Daniel, the law brother in Denver, who had written him a letter last year that had made a strong case for selling the ranch and moving to the city, and who had not quite understood why Frederick had not responded to the argument, because Daniel did not understand that a place could be a person, could be something you were made of. Eva told him about her mother, who had been a school teacher and who had taught Eva to read Latin, which was a completely impractical piece of education for the New Mexico territory, and which she was grateful for every day. She told him about the seamstress shop in Santa Fe, and the woman who ran it, a Mrs. Calder, who had been kind but who had paid Eva almost nothing and who had been, in Eva's honest assessment, running a business that depended on women having no better options. She told him about the decision to get on the stage and come to Red Rock Crossing, which had felt terrifying and correct in equal measure. "Were you frightened?" he asked. "Considerably," she said. "But I have found that the frightening decisions are usually the ones that matter." He thought about that for a moment. "When did you know you were going to stay here, in Red Rock Crossing?" She paused, and the honest answer was surprising even to her. "When I came through your gate," she said. "I saw the fence line. Solid posts, taut wire, not a sag in it. I thought someone careful lives here, someone who does things right." She met his eyes. "I thought that is the kind of place I would like to stay." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said very simply, "I am glad you thought so." On a Sunday in early October, he asked her if she would like to ride out to the North Pasture with him. Not a lesson this time, but just to see the country. And she said yes. And they rode out in the morning when the light was new, and the air was cool, and the desert was showing its best colors, the red of the earth and the gray-green of the sage and the pale gold of the dried grass. He showed her the fence repair he had made, solid and well done, and the water source on the other side of it, a small spring that had probably been there 10,000 years. He showed her a stand of cottonwoods along a dry creek bed where he said the elk came in September, and the elk had been there recently. She could see the tracks. They rode in silence for a while along a ridge with the whole of the ranch visible below them, the house and the barn and the corrals and the windmill turning in the distance, and the cattle dark dots in the pasture, and beyond it the mesa country going blue and purple in the haze. "Your father built all of that," Eva said. "My father started it," Frederick said. "I finished it. There is a great deal of it," she said. "It is enough," he said, and she could hear in the word all that it meant to him, the pride and the love and the responsibility, the whole weight and satisfaction of a life's work made visible. "Yes," she said, "it is more than enough." He looked at her, and there was a moment of perfect stillness between them, the horses standing easy on the ridge, the wind moving through the sage below, the sky huge and blue above them, and then he said quietly, "Eva." "Yes," she said, and her voice was steady. "I would like to tell you something that I have been thinking about," he said, and then he stopped, as though the next part required a different kind of courage than anything the ranch demanded of him. "You can tell me," she said. "I think," he said, and stopped again. Then, more directly, "I think that I am in love with you. I think it has been true for some time, and I am only just now brave enough to say it plainly. And I want you to know that I am saying it without any expectation, and that if you do not feel the same, then I will not make it difficult, and the position is still yours and nothing needs to change." She looked at him on his big roan horse against that enormous sky, this man who had posted an advertisement in secret desperation, and had prepared a room with fresh-washed blankets, and had sawn a little shelf for a candle holder, and had taught her to ride, and had told her how to fix a fence, and had said good night every evening from across the kitchen, and she thought about all of that. And then she said, clearly, "Frederick, I am in love with you too. I have been trying to be sensible about it." He stared at her. "I thought my position complicated things," she said. "I was afraid to make a mistake, but it would be a larger mistake not to say it." He said nothing for a long moment, and she could see him taking it in, this enormous, stubborn, careful man, taking in the information that the thing he had wanted was true. "Well," he said at last, and she could hear everything he was not saying in that single word. "Well," she agreed. He put Calhoun alongside George and reached across the space between them and took her hand, and she let him, And they sat like that on the ridge for a while with the ranch spread below them and the sky above them. And she thought that this was as good as anything she had ever felt. He kissed her for the first time that evening on the porch, after supper, which was the most practical and also somehow exactly right setting for it, because they were both people who lived their important moments in ordinary places. It was brief and certain, and she put her hand on his chest and felt his heartbeat, which was not entirely steady, and she thought with a great deal of warmth that this was the kind of man whose heart was not steady when he kissed someone he loved, which told her everything she needed to know. He proposed to her on a Sunday in November, which was 2 months after the evening they had first said the truth plainly on the ridge. He did not do it dramatically. He was not a dramatic man in his manner, though the things he felt ran deep and serious. He did it over breakfast, which Eva found both surprising and entirely characteristic of him. They were having coffee and the biscuits she had made, and he was reading a week-old newspaper from Albuquerque, and she was looking out the kitchen window at the frost on the ground that had come in the night, the first frost of the season, turning the whole yard white and clean, and he set the newspaper down and said, "Eva." She looked at him. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want you to stay here, and I want to marry you, and I want this to be your home as much as it is mine." He paused. "I do not have a great speech prepared. I'm not a speech-making man, but I know what I want, and what I want is you, here, with me." She had been moving toward yes for 2 months, and she knew it, and so she said, without any hesitation at all, "Yes, Frederick, I will marry you." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she held his, and they sat there in the kitchen with the frost on the windows and the coffee getting cold and neither of them minding. He went into Red Rock Crossing that afternoon and found a ring at the small dry goods shop that the Alvarez family ran, a ring with a small garnet set in silver that was not expensive but was honest, and he came back and put it on her finger in the yard beside the pump, and it fit perfectly, which he seemed to take as a sign. They were married in December, at the small whitewashed church on the east end of Red Rock Crossing's main road, by the Reverend Thomas Cade, who had been performing marriages in this county for 15 years, and who said with complete sincerity that he had rarely seen a more well-matched pair. Harlan Bridges was there and was visibly pleased with himself in a way that was tolerated because he was fundamentally good-hearted. Perez stood with Frederick, and Tom Ashworth stood beside Perez looking polished and uncertain in a new shirt. The woman who ran the boarding house where Eva had stayed her first 2 nights in Red Rock Crossing came and brought flowers. The Alvarez family came. A significant portion of Red Rock Crossing came, because it was December and there was not a great deal else happening, and because people were genuinely fond of Frederick Underwood even if they had been baffled by him for 3 years, and because Eva Boone in the 8 weeks she had been coming into town for supplies had made a very good impression on virtually everyone she had encountered. Eva wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that her mother had made for her years ago, and which she had kept carefully preserved through everything, knowing she would want it someday for something important. Frederick wore a dark coat and a white shirt, and a string tie that she suspected he had borrowed from someone because she had never seen it in the house, and he was so clearly making an effort at formality that she loved him for it more than she would have loved actual elegance. Reverend Cade read from Genesis and from the Psalms, which felt right for this landscape, and they said their vows in front of everyone, and Frederick's voice when he said them was low and certain, and she felt each word land like something solid being set in place, and her own voice was steady, because she was sure of this, was more sure of this than she had been of anything in years. When Reverend Cade pronounced them married and Frederick kissed her, Harlan Bridges said something that caused the woman standing next to him to elbow him in the ribs, and Tom Ashworth whooped, and Perez smiled, which on Perez was equivalent to a standing ovation. The winter that followed was the best of Eva's memory. It was cold in the New Mexico Territory in the winter of 1883 and into 1884. the kind of cold that came down from the mountains and settled into the desert nights with a particular clarity. And the house that had been, 3 months ago, too big and too silent for one man, became something entirely different, became the warmest place Eva had ever lived, not because the stove burned hotter, but because warmth is not primarily a function of temperature. Frederick learned, or rather allowed himself to do, the things he had suppressed for 3 years, which was to find pleasure in small domestic things, in the smell of the bread Eva made, in the sound of her moving through the house in the mornings, in the particular way she laughed when something genuinely surprised her, which was freely and without self-consciousness, and which he found, every single time, the most beautiful sound he had heard that day. He found that he had opinions about things he had not bothered to have opinions about when he was alone, about what they should have for Sunday dinner, about what to plant in the spring garden, about whether the dog that had appeared at the barn in November and that Tom had named Biscuit should be allowed to sleep inside the house when it was cold. He voted yes on Biscuit, and Eva seconded it, and Biscuit moved into the house and turned out to be a good and loyal dog of mixed parentage and excellent character, which Perez acknowledged with a nod when told. In February, Eva told Frederick that she thought she might be expecting a child. She told him after supper in the kitchen, in the lamplight that had become their time and place for important things, and he went very still when she said it, and she watched his face very carefully, because she wanted to see everything. What she saw was something enormous and unguarded moving across him, something that was joy and terror in equal and inseparable measure, the face of a man who has just been told that the thing he wanted has grown larger than he had calculated. "You are certain?" He asked very quietly. "I am fairly certain," she said. "I will know more in another month." He stood up from the table and came around it and crouched down beside her chair so that he was at her level, which was something he did sometimes when something mattered to him, when he needed to be at the same height rather than looking down, and he took both of her hands and held them and looked at her. "Eva," he said. "Frederick," she said, smiling, because his expression was so transparently full that it was like looking at a window with the shutters removed. "We are going to have a child," he said. "We appear to be," she agreed. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers, and they stayed like that for a moment in the lamplight, his big hands wrapped around her smaller ones, and she felt the certainty of him, the solidity, the same quality she had seen in the fence posts that first morning, and she thought that she had made the right choice in every decision that had led her here, even the frightening ones, especially the frightening ones. "I am going to be a good father," he said, and it was not a boast. It was a statement of intention, and she heard the determination in it, the man who had watched his own father and taken careful note of both the good and the not-so-good. "You are already going to be a good father," she said. "I have had some time to observe you. With the ranch hands," he said with slight amusement. "Tom is 20 and Perez has more experience than I do. With Biscuit," she said, "you sat with that dog for 3 hours when his paw was sore last week." He looked at her with the unguarded expression, and then he laughed genuinely and said, "Biscuit is easy company." "So will our child be," she said. "Eventually." In March she confirmed it with the doctor in Redrock Crossing, a doctor, Ephraim Saunders, who had been practicing medicine in the territory for 20 years and who told her she was in excellent health and that everything looked as well as he could determine. Frederick drove her into town himself and waited outside in the wagon with the focused patience of a man who is not patient at all, but is performing patience with great determination. She came out and climbed up onto the wagon seat, and he looked at her with the expression. "November," she said. "Dr. Saunders says November." He nodded and reached over and took her hand, and they drove back to the ranch in the spring light with Biscuit running alongside the wagon and the cottonwood trees along the creek showing their first pale green of the year. And Eva felt so full of something good that she did not have a word for it and thought she did not need one. The spring brought the rains that had been waited for, and the pasture grass came in thick and good, which meant the cattle fattened well, which meant the drive to the railroad depot at Cimarron in June would bring a good price. Perez and Frederick and Tom, and a man named Riley whom they hired seasonally, made the cattle drive, and Eva managed the ranch in Frederick's 3-day absence with the calm competence that Frederick had told her in the week before he left he was entirely confident in. "I know you can manage it," he said. "Perez will be back by evening the second day." "I can manage it without Perez," she said. "I know," he said. "That is what I just said." She kissed him before he rode out with the cattle and Perez and Tom and Riley, and he looked at her in the early morning with a particular expression that she had come to recognize as his version of "I do not want to go, but I must." And she said, "Be careful and come back soon." And he said, "Always," and turned Calhoun and went. He came back on the third day in the late afternoon, and she heard Calhoun's hooves on the road from the kitchen window, and she was out on the porch before he had cleared the gate. He looked dusty and tired in the specific way of a man who has been moving cattle for 3 days, and he looked up at her on the porch, and the tiredness went somewhere else in his face, replaced by the expression she liked best. "Good prices?" she asked when he dismounted. "Very good," he said, and tied Calhoun to the rail and came up the porch steps and kissed her as though he had been thinking about it since Tuesday, which she suspected he had. "I made beef stew," she said when he released her. "That is an excellent choice," he said, and she laughed, and he put his arm around her and they went inside. The summer of 1884 passed in the long, warm days that the territory did beautifully, with enough rain from the easterly storms to keep the grass going, and enough sun to warm the adobe walls of the house through the day, so that the evenings were comfortable and the nights were cool. Eva's pregnancy became apparent to the world, and the people of Red Rock Crossing were kind about it in their various ways. Harlan asked how she was feeling every time she came in, and Mrs. Alvarez brought her a bundle of herbs from her garden that she said her grandmother had sworn by, and Reverend Cade's wife gave her a book about infant care that had been published in 1880, and that was earnestly if not always accurately informative. Frederick was, as he had promised himself, attentive without being suffocating, which required a certain discipline from him, because his natural inclination was to manage anything that had the potential to go wrong. Eva appreciated the discipline. She told him so. "I am not managing you," he said one evening in August. "I know," she said. "I appreciate that you are making the effort." He looked at her and then looked at the ceiling briefly and then back at her. "I just want to make sure you have everything you need." "I have everything I need," she said. "I have this house and this ranch and you and Biscuit and George, and I am learning to ride properly." "You are riding well now," he said. "Mostly," she allowed. "You will be excellent by spring," he said. "By spring I will be a new mother," she pointed out. "My equestrian ambitions will be briefly deferred." He looked at her with the full warmth he no longer bothered to contain and said, "You are very sensible." "One of us has to be," she said. In late September, Harlan Bridges mentioned to Eva when she was in the store that he had heard from the land agent in Santa Fe that there was some pressure being put on the smaller ranches in the county by a cattle operation out of Texas that was looking to consolidate grazing lands, and that 2 of the smaller ranchers east of Red Rock Crossing had already been offered money to sell. He mentioned it carefully, because he was telling her something that he thought Frederick ought to know, and that he suspected Frederick might resist hearing from anyone except Eva. Eva told Frederick that evening, and he listened with his arms folded and the particular stillness he had when he was thinking rather than reacting, and then he said, "I have heard the name. Consolidated Cattlemen's Trust. They have been working their way north from Texas for 2 years. Should we be concerned?" she asked. "They will offer money," he said. "We will decline." He paused. "They will try again and we will decline again. This ranch is not for sale." "I know that," she said. "I wanted to make sure you knew what was coming." He looked at her. "You wanted to make sure I heard it from you first so I would not feel ambushed." "Something like that," she admitted. He came around the table and kissed the top of her head, which he sometimes did when she had done something he particularly appreciated, and said, "Thank you." The offer came in October, delivered by a man named Carson who wore a city suit and carried himself with the certainty of someone who has never been told no and does not expect to start. He rode out to the ranch on a Tuesday morning, and Frederick met him in the yard, and Eva watched from the kitchen window. The conversation was not long. She could see Frederick's posture straight and still and impenetrable, and she could see Carson trying various angles the way a man with a briefcase tries angles, and she could see Frederick not moving at all. And eventually Carson got back on his horse and rode away, and Frederick came in and poured himself a cup of coffee without saying anything. "Well?" Eva asked. "No," he said. "You told him no." "I told him no," he confirmed. "Good," she said. He sat down at the table. "He will try again." "And you will tell him no again," she said. He looked at her over the coffee cup with the gray-green eyes. "Yes," he said, "I will." The offer came twice more, through different channels, once through the land agent and once through an intermediary who tried to make the case at church, which Frederick found irritating enough that Reverend Cade had to step in and remove the conversation from the Lord's house. Eva watched Frederick navigate each approach with the same unmovable calm, and she understood that this was not stubbornness for its own sake, but something principled and deep. The understanding that this land was not simply a commercial asset, but the specific, particular ground of his life, and of their life together. The Consolidated Cattlemen's Trust moved on to more cooperative targets, and that was the end of it. The baby came on the 14th of November in the year 1884, which was a Thursday, and it was a boy. Dr. Saunders came out from Reed Rock Crossing, and Reverend Cade's wife came as well because she had helped at births before, and the labor was long but not complicated, and the cry the child made when he arrived in the world was the most absolute sound Eva had ever heard, the sound of something real beginning. Frederick was in the house. He had refused to be sent to the barn the way convention suggested, which Dr. Saunders accepted with the pragmatism of a man who had learned that fathers in the territories had their own ideas about these things. He was in the main room, and she could hear him moving periodically, and she knew he was pacing, which was one of only 2 physical manifestations of deep worry she had ever seen him produce, the other being a particular way. He pressed his thumb against his index finger when he was working something out. When the baby had been cleaned and wrapped, and the doctor had declared everything well, Reverend Cade's wife brought the child to the door and called for Frederick. And the quiet that happened when she did was a different quality of quiet from any other Eva had experienced in this house. He came in and stood beside the bed and looked at the bundle, and then he looked at Eva with the full, unguarded face, and she thought she had never in her life seen anything as moving as Frederick Underwood in that moment, this large, careful, private man looking at his son. "He is all right?" Frederick asked, and his voice was not entirely steady. "He is perfect," she said. "Do you want to hold him?" Frederick sat on the edge of the bed, and she placed the baby in his arms, and he held the child with a focus and carefulness that she recognized as the same focus and carefulness he brought to everything that mattered to him, the fence posts, the horses, the ranch, and now this. "Hello," Frederick said very quietly to the child. The baby regarded him with the dark, unfocused eyes of the newly born. "We will call him James," Eva said, "if you still want that." They had discussed names through the autumn, and James was the one they had kept returning to, the name of Frederick's grandfather on his mother's side, a man Frederick had spoken of with respect. "James," Frederick said, and the baby's eyes moved toward the sound of his voice, and Frederick's expression became, if possible, even more open and vulnerable and magnificent than it had been a moment ago. "Yes, that is right." James Frederick Underwood was introduced to Reed Rock Crossing the following Sunday, when Eva felt strong enough to make the trip in the wagon, wrapped warmly against the November chill. Harlan Bridges came out of his store when he saw them pull up, and he looked at the baby with an expression of complete approval and said, "Well, that is a fine boy," and then looked at Eva and said, "You look well," and then looked at Frederick and said nothing but nodded with the nod of a man who has been right about something for a long time and is too decent to say so. Perez, when Frederick brought the baby out to the barn to introduce him on a quiet afternoon, looked at James for a long time and then said, "He has your mother's forehead," which was the most personal thing he had ever said to Frederick, and which Frederick took, rightly, as a considerable compliment. Tom Ashworth, who had been warned that newborns were small and fragile, approached James with the expression of a man diffusing something, and then the baby grabbed Tom's finger with the particular iron grip of the newborn, and Tom's whole face changed. "He is strong," Tom said with something like reverence. "Already." "He is," Eva agreed. "He is going to be a good rancher," Tom said. "He is going to be whatever he decides to be," Eva said firmly, and Frederick said yes, in a tone that confirmed it completely, and Tom nodded in acceptance of this position. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was the richest Eva had known. James was a good baby, which she had not dared to count on but was deeply grateful for, a child who slept in his reasonable intervals and ate reliably, and seemed, from his earliest weeks, to be paying close attention to the world around him with eyes that were becoming, without any question, his father's particular shade of gray-green. Frederick was a father who had clearly been, for some time, internally preparing for the role. He was patient and consistent, and he talked to James as though the infant understood him, telling him things about the ranch and the weather and the horses, explaining the nature of cattle and the importance of good fence lines. And Eva sometimes stood in the doorway listening, and thought that she had been handed something extraordinarily good, and that she was not going to waste a moment of it. They settled into the new shape of their life, the four of them, herself and Frederick and James and Biscuit, who had appointed himself the baby's guardian with a seriousness of purpose that impressed them all. The ranch continued to run well. The cattle brought good prices the following summer. Perez stayed, as Eva had somehow known he would, and Tom Ashworth stayed, and the north pasture fence with its extra posts at every 8 feet held all winter and beyond. Frederick's brother Daniel came for Christmas of 1885, which was the first time Eva met him, and Daniel was a pleasant, energetic man of 27 who wore a city lawyer's suit, and who looked at the ranch with the expression of someone who sees value in something he does not entirely understand. He was clearly fond of Frederick in the particular fond and baffled way of a younger sibling who has taken a different road and is not quite sure which road was right. He looked at Eva with immediate and genuine approval, and he looked at James with the expression of an uncle who has not had practice with babies, but who intends to become excellent at it. On Christmas evening, after the supper dishes were cleared and James was asleep in his crib by the fire and Biscuit was lying on the hearthrug, with the heavy satisfaction of a dog who has had an excellent day, Daniel sat with his whiskey and looked around the main room, the room that Eva had scrubbed and furnished and hung with curtains and made warm and specific and particular, and said, "Frederick, this is a good life you have made." Frederick looked at Eva and she looked at him, and the lamplight was between them in the familiar way. "Yes," Frederick said, "it is." Daniel stayed through New Year's and then went back to Denver, and they drove him to the stage in the wagon and waved him off, and Eva could see that Frederick was glad to have seen him and glad in a different way that the visit was done, that they were restored to themselves. "He is good," Eva said, watching the stage disappear down the road. "He is," Frederick said. "He worries about me." "He did not look worried when he left," she observed. Frederick looked at her from beneath the brim of his hat. "No," he said, "he did not." They drove back to the ranch through the January morning, James bundled between them on the wagon seat, and the year ahead was clear and cold and completely theirs. Spring came, as it does regardless of what you have been doing, suddenly and without particular announcement, and the ranch came alive with the particular energy of the season. The garden, which Eva had made into a proper productive kitchen garden over 2 years of steady attention, was planted with tomatoes and beans and squash and onions, and the herbs that Mrs. Alvarez had recommended. And it was doing well, far better than the determined but technically challenged enterprise Frederick had been managing before her arrival. She planted flowers along the porch that year, which was not practical but which Frederick raised no objection to. Black-eyed Susans and something blue that Mrs. Alvarez identified as a variety of sage flower that would come back every year. The porch in late summer was bordered in gold and blue, and she thought her mother would have approved. James, at 1 year old, was a solid and purposeful child, who had made it his business to touch everything in the house that could be reached from floor level, and to conduct ongoing negotiations with Biscuit about various territorial matters, negotiations in which Biscuit, to his credit, was endlessly patient. He had his father's eyes and his mother's mouth and a stubbornness that could only be described as hereditary. Frederick, watching James make his determined way across the kitchen floor toward the dog water bowl for the 4th time in an hour, said to Eva, "Where do you suppose he gets that?" "I cannot imagine," she said, straight-faced. He looked at her with the expression, the one that had no shudder on it anymore. It was that same spring, on a warm afternoon in May when she was in the garden and James was in his play yard in the shade of the porch, that Eva thought about the chain of events that had brought her here. The stage from Santa Fe, the 2 miles walked with the carpet bag, the fence line that had told her something about the person who had built it, the advertisement on Harlan's post that she had read over twice and then acted on, the room with the fresh-washed blankets and the small shelf for the candle holder, the man who had stood in the kitchen doorway with his arms folded and watched himself be assessed. The second day in the main room washing windows, the certainty that had settled in her like the truth settling. This man is lonely. This man made something up to get someone to come, because what he needed was not a housekeeper. She had loved him for it, she realized now, looking back. Not in spite of the deception, small and transparent as it was, but partly because of what it said about a person. That he would not simply ask for what he needed, but that the need was large enough to make him try anyway, in the only way he could. She stood up in the garden and stretched her back and looked at the house, the solid adobe and the good porch and the flowers she had planted and the windmill turning and James sitting in his play yard talking to Biscuit, and Frederick's shape visible through the barn door, working on something with the quiet competence that was simply how he existed in the world. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked across the yard and into the barn, and he looked up when she came in, the way he always looked up, with the quick attention that she knew was specifically for her. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Everything is very all right," she said. She leaned against the barn doorway, the same place she had stood when she first came in to see about the mare's shoe all that time ago. "I was just thinking about the advertisement." He paused in what he was doing. "The one on Harlan's post," she said. He set down his tools and looked at her with a trace of the expression she had once thought of as the shutter coming down, but now she knew it was simply thought, the face he made when he was being honest with himself about something. "I have thought about that," he said. "What I did, whether it was fair to you." "It was fair enough," she said. "You provided exactly what you promised, the room, the wage, the work." "I wrote it under false pretenses," he said. "You wrote it under desperate pretenses," she said. "That is different, and I knew it by the second day. I could have left." "You did not leave," he said. "No," she said, "I did not." He walked toward her in the particular way he moved, direct and unhurried, and stopped when he was in front of her, and she looked up at him with all of the feeling she had stopped trying to contain months and months ago. "I am glad you did not leave," he said. "I know," she said. "I am glad you saw through it." "I know that too," she said. "Frederick, do you know what I think?" "Tell me," he said. "I think you told the truth even in the lie," she said. "You said you needed someone capable and honest and of good character, and you did need that. You just did not say that what you needed her for was not the cooking." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he put his hand against the side of her face and she leaned into it. "I needed her for everything," he said. "As it turned out." She smiled, and he bent and kissed her, and the barn around them was warm and smelled of hay and horses and good honest work. And outside James was making demands of biscuit, and the windmill was turning in the May breeze, and the ranch was doing what ranches do, sustaining, continuing, thriving. The years continued to unroll in the way of good years, not without difficulty, because difficulty is the texture of a real life, but with the particular quality of years that are spent in the right place with the right person doing the right work. There were hard winters and dry summers, and the ordinary sorrows that find everyone eventually. The Raydrock crossing grew somewhat. A second church went up on the north end. A proper school was established in 1887, and Eva was asked to sit on the school board, which she did with the competence that she brought to things she believed in. Frederick and Daniel, over those years, found a better understanding of each other, the kind that requires time and the willingness to let a person be who they are. Daniel came every other Christmas and sometimes in summer, and he brought his wife from 1888 onward, a cheerful woman from Ohio named Martha who liked the ranch with the enthusiasm of someone discovering a thing that is entirely new to her, and who loved James immediately and completely. In the spring of 1887, Eva had their second child, a girl they named Clara Ruth Underwood, who came into the world with strong opinions and red hair from somewhere in the family history that no one could quite account for, and who was, from the earliest age, a person of considerable character. James, at 3, inspected his sister with the caution of a child who has been the center of the universe and is not certain about this development, and then, on the second day, brought Biscuit to her crib and introduced them with great solemnity, and Biscuit regarded the baby with the same serious guardianship he had offered James, and that was settled. Frederick held Clara the way he had held James, with the same focused care, and looked at her for a long moment and then looked at Eva and said, "She is going to run everything she comes near." "Yes," Eva said, "I suspect so." "Good," he said. In the fall of 1889 they had a third child, a boy named Samuel, who was quiet and watchful, and who from the age of 4 seemed to be cataloging the ranch in his mind the way his grandfather had planned it and his father had built it. And Eva thought that they might have a rancher in Samuel, though she held the thought loosely, because you could never be sure about people. And she had learned that the best thing you could do was keep as many doors open as possible, and trust that a person would find their own right door. Perez retired in 1890 at 52 to a house in Raydrock Crossing that his daughter had purchased for him, and the farewell was not dramatic because Perez was not dramatic, but it was felt. He shook Frederick's hand and held it for a moment and said nothing, and Frederick nodded and they understood each other. He nodded to Eva and said, "Miss Boone," which was how he had always called her, and which she suspected he would always call her. "Mr. Perez," she said, and they had a mutual smile about it. Tom Ashworth, who was by then 26 and a thoroughly competent ranch hand and a young man who had grown up, Eva felt, in some ways under the umbrella of the ranch and its people, brought in a new man named Delgado to replace Perez, a young Mexican cowboy of 22 who was, by all early evidence, excellent with cattle and who had the same kind of quiet economic expertise with horses that Perez had had. The ranch continued. The cattle continued. The years did their work. In the late fall of 1891, on an evening in November that was cold and clear with the stars very bright over the territory, Eva and Frederick sat on the porch after supper, wrapped in coats, the way they sometimes did when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, which was a different kind of quiet from the quiet it had been, a quiet that was full rather than empty, the quiet of a house where things had happened and were resting. "Do you remember," Eva said, looking at the stars, "what Harlan said to me the morning I went to inquire about the position?" "What did he say?" Frederick asked. "He said you were going to pretend you needed the help for the cooking and the cleaning," she said. "He said it as plain as anything." Frederick was quiet for a moment. "Harlan Bridges has always known more about me than I appreciated," he said. "He was not wrong," she said. No, he said, he was not. A pause. Did it put you off? It made me curious, she said. There is a difference. He made a sound that was his version of a laugh in a quiet moment. A woman who is made curious by a warning rather than warned by it, he said. I should have expected nothing less. What did you expect, she asked, when you put the notice up? He thought about it for a moment, the way he thought about things he was being fully honest about. I do not know, he said. Someone who would come and do the work and perhaps, over time, make the house feel less like a building. He paused. I did not expect you. What did you expect me to be? She asked. Not what you were, he said. Not someone who saw through it on the second day and did not leave and did not make me feel foolish for it. She looked at him in the starlight, this man who was the shape of her life now, who had built things of lasting value with his hands and his stubbornness, and his capacity for love that ran so deep and quiet that it had needed an advertisement and a woman who walked 2 miles with a carpet bag to find its way to the surface. You were not foolish, she said. You were brave, in your particular way. It did not feel brave, he said. The brave things rarely do, she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned against his side. And the stars over the New Mexico territory were extraordinary in the way they always were on a clear November night, going back and back into a depth that was humbling and magnificent in equal measure. And the house behind them was warm with sleeping children and the sleeping dog and the particular heat of a life well built. And the fence lines ran straight in the dark around a ranch that was theirs, solid and taut, not a sag in them anywhere. Eva, he said, she said, I would like to tell you something. She smiled against his coat. You can tell me. I think, he said, and she recognized the cadence, the same one he had used on the ridge with the whole ranch below them and the sky above, that hiring a housekeeper was the most important thing I have ever done. She laughed softly and looked up at him and said, I think answering an advertisement was the most important thing I have ever done. He looked down at her with the expression she had loved from the first time it was fully visible, the one with nothing hidden behind it, the one that was just Frederick Underwood, all the way through, honest and serious and warm. We are well matched, he said. We are, she agreed. He kissed her in the cold November air with the stars overhead. And inside the house James and Clara and Samuel slept in the rooms that had been built with patience and intention on the foundation of a ranch that had been built the same way. And Biscuit slept on the hearthrug, and the fire burned low in the stone fireplace. And the curtains that Eva had sewn from plain cotton 8 years ago had long since been replaced by better ones. And the little shelf with the candle holder was still on the wall of what was now a sewing room, and the garnet ring still fit as well as it had on the day. He slid it onto her finger beside the pump in the yard, and Redrock Crossing was quiet in the way of small towns at night, and the windmill turned in the November wind, and everything that had been broken was mended, and everything that had been empty was full. And the story that had begun with a hammer and a nail and a handwritten notice on a post outside a general store had become the whole shape of 2 lives, solid and particular and exactly right, with not a sag in it anywhere.